The atmosphere in the executive boardroom of Aegis Dynamics felt unusually sterile, carrying the sharp scent of expensive citrus polish and unfiltered ambition. I knew my tenure was over the exact moment Chloe Thorne walked in and refused to make eye contact. She was 32 years old, holding an MBA from an elite institution, and carried herself with the kind of unearned confidence that only came from venture capital connections and a profound lack of practical experience. I sat across from her, feeling the heavy silence stretch between us. My name is Wesley Vance. I am 56 years old, and I have dedicated the past 28 years of my life to building the foundational encryption architecture that transformed Aegis Dynamics from a struggling startup into a defense contractor powerhouse. I wrote the code that secured massive military contracts. I built the systems that kept our communication networks impenetrable. Now, I was sitting across from a freshly minted executive who looked at me not as the architect of her company's success, but as a quarterly expense that needed immediate elimination. Her first words to me were devoid of greeting or gratitude. Instead, she leaned forward, steepled her fingers, and launched into a monologue about optimization and agile paradigms. She spoke about needing a more dynamic workforce, a team that could pivot seamlessly in the modern technological landscape. I listened to her string together corporate buzzwords, feeling a strange sense of detachment. She had never written a single line of operational code. She had never stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights, troubleshooting a server failure during a critical Pentagon deployment. She did not know the sacrifices required to build something lasting. She simply opened a sleek leather folder and informed me that my position was being eliminated as part of a strategic realignment. Chloe smiled a terrifyingly hollow smile that did not reach her eyes and told me that if I could not adapt to their visionary new direction, the door was right there. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand explanations or point out the sheer absurdity of firing the senior engineer, who understood the proprietary architecture better than anyone alive. I merely looked at the framed photograph of my daughter Lauren Vance sitting on my desk. I remembered missing Lauren Vance's college graduation because Aegis Dynamics experienced a catastrophic database failure that only I could resolve. I remembered the countless family dinners I skipped, the vacations I canceled, and the sheer volume of my life I had poured into this company. And now, I was being handed a severance package that read more like an insult than a compensation for decades of loyalty. In a situation like this, a younger man might have shouted. A less experienced professional might have threatened legal action on the spot. But I understood the mechanics of corporate warfare far better than Chloe ever could. Silence, in the face of arrogance, is often the most devastating strategy. I calmly closed my laptop, tucked the termination folder under my arm, and walked out of the glass-enclosed conference room. I walked past the rows of engineers I had trained, past the human resources personnel who awkwardly averted their gaze, and past the gleaming corporate logos that I had helped finance through my sleepless nights. I left the building without a word, carrying nothing but my personal effects and a quiet, burning realization that they had just made the most expensive mistake in their corporate history. I did not go straight home. I needed a moment to process the sheer audacity of what had just transpired. I drove to a worn-down diner a few miles from the corporate park, ordered a black coffee, and sat in a vinyl booth listening to the hum of the old refrigerator. For 28 years, Aegis Dynamics had been the center of my professional universe. When I started, we were operating out of a cramped industrial unit. Our founder, General Walter Reed, understood the value of hard work and operational integrity. He knew that the software we were developing was not just a product, but a critical component of national security. But over the years, as the company grew and the venture capitalists moved in, the culture shifted. It became less about building robust systems and more about maximizing shareholder value at any cost. Chloe Thorne was the embodiment of that cultural rot. She viewed employees as disposable assets, completely ignorant of the fact that the very foundation of her empire rested on the intellectual property I had designed. I finished my coffee, paid the waitress in cash, and drove back to my house. The familiar scent of old wood and leather greeted me as I opened the front door. My golden retriever, Buster, trotted over, his tail wagging hesitantly, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I patted his head, walked into my home office, and poured myself a generous measure of aged bourbon. I sat at my desk and pulled a small fireproof lockbox from the bottom drawer. Inside that box was a manila envelope that I had not opened in 16 years. The paper was slightly yellowed, but the legal text printed on it was as sharp and relevant as the day it was drafted. 16 years ago, during a particularly volatile period of corporate restructuring at Aegis Dynamics, I had a conversation with my old friend and intellectual property attorney, Harvey. We had been discussing the chaotic state of the company's legal documentation. Harvey, possessing the kind of foresight that made him exceptional at his job, advised me to file the provisional patent for my core encryption algorithm under my own name. He insisted that I could always assign it to the company later when their legal department stabilized. However, the legal department never stabilized. They simply became more focused on aggressive expansion than proper documentation. Aegis Dynamics had been licensing my proprietary framework under a temporary agreement that contained a highly specific, carefully buried clause. The clause explicitly stated that in the event of my involuntary termination without cause, the full rights to the patent would automatically revert to me within 24 hours of formal notice. For 16 years, that clause had sat dormant, an invisible safety net waiting for a moment precisely like this one. Nobody in the current administration knew it existed. The lawyers who drafted it were long gone, replaced by junior associates who only read what they were told to read. Chloe Thorne, in her infinite wisdom and desperate pursuit of optimization, had just triggered the reversion clause. I opened my laptop and reviewed the termination notice. It was undeniably an involuntary termination without cause. The arrogance of youth had blinded her to the necessity of due diligence. She assumed I was merely legacy overhead, a relic of the past, who could be swept away to make room for cheaper, more compliant developers. She had no idea that she had just voluntarily surrendered the legal rights to the $75 million encryption patent that served as the backbone of their upcoming Pentagon demonstration. I took a sip of the bourbon, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, and opened a secure communication channel to Harvey. I attached a scanned copy of the original agreement and typed a brief message asking him to verify the validity of the reversion trigger. I did not have to wait long. Harvey called me within the hour. His voice was steady, methodical, and laced with a hint of grim satisfaction. He confirmed what I already knew. The clause was ironclad. Because they had terminated me without cause, the ownership of the patent would revert to me the moment I filed the formal notice with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He reminded me that the 24-hour window was critical and advised me to execute the filing immediately. The digital paperwork took less than 20 minutes to complete. I navigated the familiar interface of the Patent Office portal, uploaded the necessary documentation, and officially triggered the reversion. With a single click, the intellectual property that Aegis Dynamics had built its entire valuation upon was legally returned to my sole possession. I watched the confirmation screen load, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. I was not angry. Anger is an emotional response, and what I was executing was a calculated strategic maneuver. As I sat there in the quiet of my home office, with Buster sleeping at my feet and the city lights beginning to flicker outside my window, I realized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Across the city, Chloe and her executive team were likely celebrating their successful cost-cutting measures, completely oblivious to the fact that they were now legally trespassing on my intellectual property. They were scheduled to present the new software build to high-ranking military officials in just a few days, a build that relied entirely on the encryption algorithms I now exclusively owned. I closed the laptop, finished my drink, and prepared for the storm that would inevitably arrive when they finally realized the catastrophic error they had made. The next morning broke with the kind of crisp, unforgiving sunlight that seemed entirely inappropriate for the storm brewing within the walls of Aegis Dynamics. Inside the corporate headquarters, the daily machinery of the business continued to grind forward, completely ignorant of the foundational fracture that had just occurred. I later learned from former colleagues that Chloe convened an all-hands meeting at precisely 9 o'clock. She stood before the remaining staff, projecting an aura of invincibility, and delivered a heavily rehearsed speech about streamlining operations and embracing agile methodologies. She framed my departure not as the catastrophic loss of their chief architect, but as a necessary shedding of legacy overhead. She promised the team that, without the burden of outdated perspectives, they would accelerate the timeline for the upcoming Pentagon demonstration. She spoke with the fervent conviction of someone who genuinely believed that slick presentations and dynamic synergy could somehow compensate for a fundamental lack of underlying technology. She was entirely oblivious to the reality that every line of code her development team was currently compiling was legally trespassing on my intellectual property. The reckoning began quietly, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the subtle ping of an automated notification in the depths of the legal department. An ambitious young intern, tasked with monitoring intellectual property filings and competitor patents, was reviewing the daily updates from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. According to the standard operating procedure, he entered the registration numbers for the core algorithms that Aegis Dynamics utilized in their defense contracts. When the results populated on his screen, he expected to see the familiar corporate entity listed as the owner. Instead, he saw my name. The intern initially assumed it was a clerical error, a glitch in the government database. He refreshed the page multiple times, his anxiety escalating with each identical result. The registration clearly stated that the patent was now the exclusive property of Wesley Vance, effective precisely 24 hours after my involuntary termination. Realizing the magnitude of what he had discovered, he immediately printed the confirmation and sprinted to the office of the General Counsel. The reaction within the legal department was one of absolute, unadulterated panic. The senior attorneys rushed to pull the original employment contracts and licensing agreements from the archives, desperately searching for a loophole or a misinterpretation. What they found instead was the ironclad reversion clause that Harvey and I had drafted 16 years prior. The reality of their situation crashed down upon them with terrifying clarity. If Aegis Dynamics proceeded with the Pentagon demonstration utilizing my encryption algorithm, they would be committing willful and deliberate patent infringement under 35 U.S.C. Section 271. The legal and financial repercussions of demonstrating stolen technology to the United States military were catastrophic, potentially exposing the company to treble damages and immediate federal injunctions. The crisis deepened as the legal team began to unravel the full extent of Chloe's mismanagement. In her desperate rush to optimize the workforce, she had systematically terminated dozens of senior employees without providing the mandatory 60-day advance notice required by the Warren Act. This blatant violation of federal labor laws exposed the company to massive class action lawsuits and severe regulatory penalties. But the most damning discovery was yet to come. The General Counsel, attempting to understand how this catastrophic oversight had occurred, demanded to see all recent documentation regarding intellectual property assignments. Buried in the recent files was a hastily drafted, backdated IP transfer agreement bearing my signature. The only problem was that I had never signed it. Upon closer inspection, it became undeniably clear that Chloe, realizing her potential exposure late the previous night, had attempted to forge my signature on the transfer document. This desperate act elevated her incompetence to outright criminality. By attempting to manufacture consent, she had committed forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, because the document was entirely fraudulent. Any legal claim it purported to establish was void ab initio, meaning it was legally invalid from the moment of its creation. Her attempt to cover her tracks had only provided me with the ultimate leverage to destroy her career. While the legal department descended into chaos, I remained in the quiet comfort of my home, taking Buster for a long walk and enjoying the rare luxury of a completely unstructured morning. I knew it was only a matter of time before the founder realized the gravity of the situation. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the private number of General Walter Reed. I answered on the second ring, my voice calm and collected. The general sounded older than I remembered, his characteristic authority replaced by a frantic desperation. He demanded to know what was happening, asking if the rumors regarding the patent reversion were true. I did not raise my voice or attempt to gloat. I simply confirmed the facts, explaining that the reversion clause had been triggered by my involuntary termination without cause. The general was silent for a long moment, the heavy realization settling over him. He asked me why I had not come to him directly, why I had allowed this to happen. I explained that loyalty is a reciprocal arrangement, and that Aegis Dynamics had demonstrated a profound lack of loyalty when they allowed an inexperienced executive to discard me like obsolete hardware. I told him that I understood the nature of betrayal intimately. Many years ago, my ex-wife had attempted a similar maneuver, trying to claim a significant portion of my assets during our divorce despite her clear violations of our marital agreements. I had been forced to invoke the infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement to protect what I had built. Chloe's actions felt remarkably similar. A blatant breach of fiduciary duty driven by greed and a profound disrespect for the foundational agreements that governed our relationship. I explained to the general that Chloe had not only jeopardized the company's intellectual property, but she had also attempted to manipulate my stock options and pension benefits during the termination process. Given my age and the deceptive nature of her actions, her conduct could easily be construed as elder financial abuse under California Welfare and Institutions, Code Section 1561030. She had attempted to strip me of my life's work and my financial security, assuming I would simply fade away quietly. But the patent reversion had neutralized her entire strategy, rendering her schemes entirely irrelevant. The general listened in stunned silence as I laid out the extent of Chloe's incompetence and criminality. He realized that the company he had built was now entirely at the mercy of the man they had just fired. I did not make any immediate demands. I simply told him that I would be in touch regarding the licensing terms for my intellectual property, and I ended the call, leaving him to deal with the wreckage Chloe had created. The day of the Pentagon demonstration arrived with a suffocating tension that seemed to permeate the very air inside the Aegis Dynamics Presentation Center. The facility had been meticulously prepared to showcase this next generation of defense technology. Featuring an imposing array of high-definition displays, polished metal surfaces, and carefully curated lighting designed to project an image of absolute technological supremacy. High-ranking military officials, prominent defense contractors, and key members of the Department of Defense filled the leather seating, their expressions expectant and serious. They were here to witness the unveiling of a proprietary encryption platform that Aegis Dynamics had boldly claimed would revolutionize secure military communications. Behind the sleek presentation stage, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of adrenaline and barely concealed panic. Chloe Thorne, dressed in an immaculately tailored designer suit that cost more than most of the engineering staff earned in a month, was furiously pacing the green room. She was practically vibrating with nervous energy, rehearsing her opening remarks and barking last-minute instructions at the terrified production staff. She remained willfully ignorant of the legal catastrophe unfolding just down the hall, choosing instead to focus entirely on the optics of the presentation. She genuinely believed that her charisma and a few carefully crafted PowerPoint slides could somehow overwrite the fundamental reality that they no longer possessed the legal right to utilize the technology they were about to demonstrate. However, the legal department had not been idle. The general counsel, having finally grasped the full magnitude of the situation and the potentially apocalyptic consequences of proceeding with the demonstration, had engaged in a frantic series of emergency meetings with the remaining members of the executive board and General Walter Reed. The consensus was unanimous and bleak. Proceeding with the presentation would constitute a blatant and highly public act of willful patent infringement, exposing the entire organization to immediate federal prosecution and potentially resulting in the permanent revocation of their defense contracting clearances. The risk was simply too immense to ignore, regardless of the immediate embarrassment of canceling the event. Just as the introductory sequence began playing on the massive screens, A high production value montage featuring generic military imagery synchronized to an overly dramatic orchestral score. The general counsel stepped out from the shadows of the wing. He moved with a grim, practiced deliberation, intercepting Chloe just as she adjusted her microphone and prepared to stride onto the stage. He did not speak loudly, but his voice carried the heavy, unmistakable tone of absolute authority. He informed her, in no uncertain terms, that the demonstration was immediately canceled, citing an irreconcilable intellectual property dispute that required immediate resolution. Chloe's reaction was a study in profound cognitive dissonance. She initially attempted to brush him off, laughing nervously, and insisting that whatever minor clerical error he had discovered could be easily rectified after the presentation. She argued that canceling the event now, with the room full of their most important clients, would be a public relations disaster from which the company might never recover. The general counsel, maintaining his grim composure, leaned in closely and delivered the final, devastating blow. He informed her that there was no clerical error. He explained that Wesley Vance had officially and legally reclaimed the sole ownership of the core encryption patent, and that proceeding with the demonstration would constitute a federal crime for which she would be held, personally and criminally liable. The blood drained from Chloe's face as the reality of her colossal miscalculation finally penetrated her carefully constructed facade of invincibility. She stood frozen, staring blankly at the general counsel as the introductory video concluded and the audience waited in expectant silence. The silence stretched for an agonizing eternity before a senior vice president, moving with the heavy resignation of a man walking to his own execution, stepped onto the stage. He approached the podium, gripping the edges tightly as if bracing for a physical impact, and delivered a brief, heavily sanitized statement regarding a sudden technical complication that necessitated the immediate postponement of the demonstration. He apologized profusely for the inconvenience and assured the attendees that they would be contacted shortly with further details. The audience, composed of seasoned military professionals who possessed a keen instinct for detecting corporate obfuscation, immediately recognized that they were not being told the entire truth. The room erupted into a low, buzzing murmur of speculation and discontent as the attendees began packing their briefcases and filing toward the exits. The carefully orchestrated illusion of technological supremacy had shattered, replaced by the unmistakable stench of institutional incompetence. Within an hour, the news of the canceled demonstration had permeated the entire industry, and the value of Aegis Dynamics stock began a rapid and terrifying descent. While the corporate empire she had attempted to commandeer rapidly crumbled around her, I remained in my study, reviewing the preliminary drafts of the licensing agreement that Harvey had prepared. I had instructed him to construct the terms with maximum prejudice, ensuring that the financial and structural consequences of their actions would be both profound and lasting. I was not interested in simply returning to the status quo. I was determined to fundamentally restructure the power dynamics of the organization to ensure that nothing resembling this catastrophe could ever occur again. The terms were uncompromising. First, Aegis Dynamics would be required to pay an immediate, non-refundable upfront licensing fee of $15 million for the continued use of the encryption architecture. Second, I would receive a 12% royalty on all future revenue generated by any system utilizing my proprietary algorithms. Third, I demanded a permanent voting seat on the executive board of directors, ensuring that I would have direct oversight of all future technological and strategic initiatives. Finally, and most importantly, I required the immediate, public, and irrevocable resignation of Chloe Thorne, accompanied by a comprehensive internal investigation into her fraudulent attempt to forge my signature on the intellectual property transfer documents. When the General Counsel and General Walter Reed received the document, they recognized immediately that they possessed absolutely no leverage in the negotiation. They were entirely at my mercy, trapped by a legal snare of their own making. The alternative to accepting my terms was the complete dissolution of the company and years of grueling federal litigation. They capitulated within 48 hours, signing the agreement without requesting a single modification. The transition of power was swift and merciless. Chloe was escorted from the building by corporate security, her personal effects packed into a cardboard box, her once promising career permanently destroyed by a toxic combination of arrogance and profound incompetence. She had attempted to optimize the workforce and ended up optimizing herself right out of the industry. Her departure was met with a deafening silence from the remaining staff, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity with which I had departed just days earlier. The following Monday, I returned to the Aegis Dynamics headquarters. I did not enter through the standard employee entrance, nor did I proceed to my former cubicle in the engineering department. I walked directly into the executive suite, taking my rightful place at the head of the boardroom table. The general counsel and the remaining executives regarded me with a mixture of profound respect and carefully concealed apprehension. They understood that I was no longer just the brilliant engineer who maintained the systems. I was the primary stakeholder, the architect of their survival, and the absolute authority on the technological direction of the company. As I looked around the room, taking in the nervous expressions and the palpable shift in the corporate atmosphere, I felt a deep, abiding sense of satisfaction. I had not sought this confrontation, nor had I desired to inflict such massive disruption upon the company I had helped build. But I had refused to allow my life's work to be stolen and mismanaged by individuals who possessed neither the expertise nor the integrity to understand its true value. I had utilized the very legal mechanisms they had ignored to protect myself and to ensure that the foundational principles of the organization were restored. The experience had tested me, forcing me to confront the ruthless nature of modern corporate governance. But it had also reaffirmed my belief in the power of strategic foresight and quiet, unyielding competence. I had secured my financial future, protected my intellectual property, and reclaimed my position at the helm of the organization. As the meeting commenced and we began the arduous process of rebuilding the shattered confidence of our clients, I knew that Aegis Dynamics would eventually recover. But it would be a different company, a stronger company, forged in the fires of a near-fatal crisis and guided by the steady hand of the man who had laid its very foundations. And as I reviewed the new architectural proposals, surrounded by a team that finally understood the true cost of excellence, I knew that my legacy was finally irrevocably secure.